there is a reluctance in the family court to want to talk about parental alienation. There is a reluctance in the family court system to want to accept that parental alienation syndrome, implacable hostility, call it what you will, there is a reluctance to want to accept that such a thing exists. And the courts will avoid, with all measure, including parental alienation within the symptoms of a case. Run the intro. I want to talk today about a case that we were involved in a while ago now, which is resolved in a fashion. And it is a case that, regardless of how you want to describe it, the simplest term to use, it is a case of parental alienation. We have two parents, we have some children. One of the parents leaves the family home. He doesn't leave for any particular reason. He doesn't leave because he's having an affair. He leaves because he believes that the marriage he is in is loveless, and it is the right thing for him to do for his own mental health. It is the right thing for him to do on behalf of his wife in order to help her mental health, and it also is the right thing to do for the children, because the children are in this boiling pot of tension while everybody's in the house. He takes the decision to leave. Over the course of the next couple of months, he has a fairly healthy relationship with his children. He sees them pretty often. He's dad. So he does almost what he used to do when he was in the family home. He does a few school pickups. He takes them to a couple of clubs. He does what dads do. One day, after having been out with the children and they'd been larking about in a park or wherever it had been, he gets home and he returns the children to mum, and he says, well, okay, I'll see you on whatever it is the next appointment is, Saturday, let's say. I'll see you on Saturday. The following day, he received a message from mum via text which says, the children have stated that they don't want to see you anymore. So obviously he replies and said, oh, what's happened? What's upset them? When this, what are we doing? Are we leaving Saturday? Should I come next week? And that kind of conversation. The reply I got back was, no, you don't understand. The children don't want to see you ever again. We then launch ourselves into the world of court proceedings. It's ugly. It is confrontational. It is a battle between these two parents. Mum has got the children are taking this stance that says we do not want to see dad anymore, and in fact to the point where the children are becoming quite rude in their approach. We get to the point where CAFCAS recommend that we use a little process that they have called ICFA, Improving Children and Families. And it's an intervention. It's a process whereby it's family therapy. Let's call it family therapy, where the CAFCAS people work with the children and work with mum and work with dad and see whether they can improve this situation. It doesn't improve. It doesn't improve because mum refuses to engage in the ICFA process. It doesn't improve because the children refuse to engage in the ICFA process and are still adamant in their view that they don't want to see dad, that they have no time for dad, that they have, by this point, obviously a number of months down the road, I think probably a year or more down the road, they have what can best be described as a disdain or a hatred for dad. And that's quite unnatural in two young children. Frustrated by the failure of the ICFA process, the parties within the proceedings, being led by the children's guardian, who is they're in place in order to lead what is in the best interest of the children. Psychological evaluation is brought up and is discussed, and the judge who held this matter throughout the case, the judge is of the opinion that we need to understand why it is that these children have formed this view, and this view obviously over time now, because months have now passed since Dad has last seen them, so this view is now cemented, this view is now locked in, and the judge says it is vital that we do our best to try and understand where this view has come from, how it's formed. And so he instructs, he orders, he directs psychological evaluation for all members of this particular family. So what that means is that Mum and Dad were interviewed at great length over a number of hours by a psychologist, and the children were interviewed at great length and observed, obviously in a very sensitive way, over a number of hours by a child psychologist. And these two experts, these two psychologists came together, considered their opinions between the two of them, and then formed a report, and that report was then presented back to the parties being Mum and Dad, and obviously the court and Kafkas. That report is 175 pages long. That report explores in great detail the background to Dad, where he came from, what his childhood was like, what his formative years were like, what his teenage years were like, what he did as a young man, how he arrives as being a parent, what he did as a parent, his view about being a parent. It explores Mum under the same premise, all the same rules. Where she came from, her childhood, etc., etc. It explores the children in terms of trying to get a handle in a very sensitive way on how it is or why it is they have formed these views. And then we arrive back in court. Mum and Dad have been given the opportunity to write statements in response to the psychological evaluation, to give their view of what they believe is being said and their opinion around it. Dad's view is a fairly simple one. The psychological evaluation says that because Dad has no contact with the children, aside from the initial upset and trauma of him leaving the family home, his opportunity to impact or influence the children's reaction is almost nil because he has no contact with them. The children live at home with Mum. The psychological evaluation explores some issues around Mum's childhood, explores some issues around Mum's attitude as an adult, and begins to suggest, in fairly strong terms, that an environment has been created at home whereby the children are almost encouraged to regard their father with total disdain, where the children are almost encouraged to insult their father and insult his memory, where the children are told stories of what has happened when they were younger, episodes that they would not remember because they are too young, but they are told about episodes when they were young, about what happened. And invariably, reading through the report, those episodes are there in order to denigrate Dad and suggest that Dad was abusive when they were little, that Dad was neglectful when they were little, that Dad was self-centred, self-serving, and just not a family man. If you tell a child the same story repeatedly, there is a point in time where the child starts to absorb the story, and there is a point in time where the child starts to tell you the story because the child believes it to be true. It believes it to be true because you, as the influencing parent, told them. Father wrote his statement, and in Father's statement he was candid. He said with absolute candour that the report clearly indicates that the children have been alienated. It clearly indicates that one parent has set the children against the absent parent through manipulation, through coercion, through this storytelling to instill this history that didn't happen, but if you tell the story enough times, it did. Mum wrote a rebuttal statement, a very blunt rebuttal statement, where she suggested that, frankly, the psychologists didn't really know what they were talking about. That she said that the psychologists had opened with a very clear view on where they were going to lead this, evaluation, and so she entirely dismissed the evaluation. The reason I'm telling you this story, and the reason I've given you the background to this story and how we arrived, is because if you'd read that report, that 175-page report, you too would be of the same opinion that Dad was. You too would be of the same opinion that I was. That the children had been manipulated, coerced, coached, crafted and shaped in order to believe a history, in order to believe a story of their lives so far. Two medically qualified, long list of credentials, published psychologists had drawn that conclusion. The court was reluctant, noticeably reluctant, to use the phrase, to acknowledge the phrase, to embrace the phrase parental alienation in discussing that evaluation. They explored how upsetting it must have been, how some emotional trigger must have prompted the children to start to react in this way, but they avoided that phrase, parental alienation, or perhaps the more acceptable phrase, implacable hostility, but they avoided them both. The court accepted that the children had formed an opinion that was adverse to their view of Dad. They had formed an opinion that ultimately was going to get in the way of any opportunity to rekindle with Dad. But at no point would the court entertain, and indeed the court order which has come out, came out at the time, at no point would the court entertain the phrasing parental alienation, implacable hostility. They just simply would not entertain that was so. Now, there are lots of videos on this channel, on this platform, and on many other platforms that explore parental alienation, and there is lots been written about the fact that parental alienation, up to a point, has been discredited because of how it sort of came into the public domain in the 80s and coming into the 90s. There is a view that it has been discredited as a sort of almost pseudoscience, that's not true, that it doesn't happen. But regardless of whether there is some discrediting around how it is that the phrasing of parental alienation syndrome, how it is that phrasing arrived in our language, in our dictionary, the reality is that it describes something that is very evident in a number of the cases that we here at McKenzie Picave have been involved in. It describes something where children have been influenced and coerced. It describes something where children have been manipulated in order for them to absorb and believe a narrative that never actually took place. In order to distance themselves from one parent, in order to alienate themselves from one parent. That story that I was telling at the start of this, just to round that off, the The psychologist recommended a very intensive therapy process in order to try and rebuild a relationship between father, between dad and the children. And it was ordered and it was directed, and the order came out, and Mum ignored it because she refused point blank to accept that it had even existed, it even happened. Point blank refused. So the relationship between those children and that dad is still non-existent. And still, the family court system here in the UK is reluctant to accept the premise of parental alienation. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to learn more about Daniel Picave Counselling, watch that video. If you want to learn more about McKenzie Picave Family Law, watch that video. And remember to subscribe, because 68% of you haven't. See you next time.